Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm Stacy. I'm a registered nurse. If you're new here, welcome in. If you're coming back, I'm so glad to have you. We talked a little bit about things that when people ask you, you should have the ability to say no. And in keeping with that theme, I would like to say, have you ever been asked to do something that you did not feel comfortable doing as a nurse? Has your superior or another nurse ever asked you to do something that you didn't feel comfortable doing as a nurse, that you didn't feel was in your scope of practice? And how did you handle that? Let's talk about it. And if you like what you see here, then I ask that you like, subscribe, and follow for more. How many times have you been working alongside somebody and someone asked you to do something for them? Whether that be a supervisor, whether that be a doctor, or whether that be a colleague. Has this ever happened to you? And what did you do? What kinds of things did you discuss with that person? You know, sometimes people ask us to do things that don't feel right. And in those cases, we should really look into whether it is something that is in our scope of practice. Sometimes we're asked to do things as nurses that really truly are not in our scope of practice. And we feel like because other people are doing it, maybe we should be doing it too. And then there's the situation of being asked to do something that you've never done before, a procedure, a treatment, a medication that you're not familiar with. It's really important that if you're not comfortable doing something or you have no experience with it, that you don't just jump right in and do it. Because in healthcare, we're dealing with people's lives and we're dealing with life and death. If you make the wrong decision, you could end somebody's life. Now, I'm a hospice nurse, and I am dealing with people who are at the end of their life. That being said, my goal is not to end anybody's life by an error or a mistake or doing something that I should not be doing as a nurse. When somebody is on hospice, for example, our goal is to allow them to have a natural death, to allow their disease to run its natural course, and to allow them to be comfortable in that process while they're at home. So our goal is not to limit life or end life as hospice nurses. I always like to make that disclaimer. Also, I would like to say that anything that I say on my videos is strictly my opinion based upon my experience, and you should always consult with other professionals and your state regulations, and don't do it just because I said it. Always look into it. That's the point of my video. If somebody asks you to do something, a supervisor, for example, and you feel like it's not in your scope of practice, my advice to you as another nurse, as a friend, as a colleague, would be look it up. There's a website for every state that you live in. It talks about your Nurse Practice Act. It talks about what's in your scope of practice. In each state, there is a Nurse Practice Act, and there are guidelines for what is in your scope of practice. In some states, LVNs, LPNs are allowed to be delegated to do IV therapy. They can hang IVs. They can do a lot of things that they've been delegated to depending on the state. I don't want to say that they are allowed to do those things because, again, I think that you should look up your state's Nurse Practice Act if you are unsure. And if you know it's not a nursing responsibility, you know it's not, you have the right to say, I'm not comfortable doing that, and I would prefer not to do that under my license. Because, you know, as healthcare professionals, as nurses, as any level of healthcare professional, we have studied, taken tests, done clinicals, and worked our behinds off to get these credentials. You didn't get these credentials for free, and they weren't easy, and they weren't cheap. So my recommendation to you is to protect yourself and CYA always. And if you don't know if you should do something and if it's in your scope of practice, you should always look into that. Sometimes a whole unit, a whole group of people will be doing the wrong thing. Okay, and you can't be a follower. You have to protect the credentials that you work to earn. You have to protect your license. You have to cover your own butt. And if you know something is wrong, speak up. Say something to someone. Don't be afraid to go to a supervisor and say, hey, I believe this is outside of my scope of practice. I do not feel comfortable doing this, nor do I think that this is in the scope of practice of XYZ level of nursing. You know, in some units, in some facilities, CNAs have additional responsibilities that they may not have in other facilities. I know that hospitals have extended responsibilities that CNAs can be delegated to do. And in a nursing home, for example, or in hospice, for example, the things that a CNA can be delegated to do are not the same as a CNA might be delegated to do in a different role. There are things such as med techs too. Different states have med techs, and that is a CNA who has been trained to give medications in a certain capacity. There are certain things that even med techs shouldn't be doing when they are practicing as med techs. I work in a state that uses med techs. In some facilities like long-term care, assisted living uses med techs. I have lived in states where they use med techs in assisted livings, and those are people that don't have credentials, that have taken a course to be able to administer medications as they are written in a medication administration record. They may not know the medications that they're giving, and there are certain medications that are beyond their ability to give. And I remember the first time I worked in an assisted living and I had to delegate people to pass medications. And I made sure when I was delegating those people that I was also providing education. Now, I was the nurse in the facility and I was supervising those people, and they were working under my license. So it was important to me that they understand, what is furosemide? What does it do? What is warfarin? What are we giving it for? What is the importance of, holding a blood pressure medication? Now, in assisted living facilities where there's a nurse present and there might be parameters, the nurse usually has to involve themselves in the administration of that medication or the supervision of giving that medication. For example, a med tech in an assisted living cannot draw up insulin, morphine, any of those things. They can't make a decision or an assessment about what should be given. They are doing exactly what is written for them to do, and it's often written in layman's terms, not in medical terms. It's written so that they can understand how to give it. And so it would be insulin pens that a number can be dialed to. It would be, if somebody was taking morphine on hospice, it would be a scheduled dose, and it would be a prescribed dose in a syringe that was already pre-filled by a pharmacist. So in an assisted living situation where a med tech is passing meds, they are under the license of a registered nurse. There is someone in the facility that has reviewed those orders, checked the doctor's order, and put those orders into the medication administration record for the med tech to give. In a long-term care facility, again, a registered nurse or an LPN or LVN has processed that order, and it has been double checked by another LPN or registered nurse for accuracy, hopefully. But med techs in a long-term care facility, in a skilled nursing facility, for example, they also have certain limitations of things that they can and cannot give. For example, they cannot administer PRN narcotics. They cannot give medications that require a parameter for blood pressure or insulin. They can check blood sugars. They can check a blood pressure. But honestly, as a nurse on the floor, this is where my boundaries come in. If it's a medication that I have to give, even if the CNA was able to check that blood pressure or check that blood pressure or pulse, I feel like as a nurse, that's part of my assessment of the patient, and that I should be checking those things before I administer those medications and not base my assessment on another person's numbers. So that is an ethical thing, and it goes into scope of practice. I know in some states, CNAs and med techs are not even permitted to check a blood pressure or a pulse or do vital signs. They have to be delegated to do those things. And some states, that is not even taught to CNAs. And I remember when I was a brand new nurse on the floor that, we would give our CNAs a list of vital signs to take. We had vital signs that needed to be taken every shift. People on antibiotics, people who had had a fall, people who had incidents that had happened, people that were on a new medication. They were on a vital sign list that had to be checked. And I remember we would write the names down. The CNAs would go and obtain the blood pressures and the vital signs and then bring them to you at some point in your shift. But over time, I began to see that those numbers weren't necessarily accurate. And even though when I became a CNA many years ago, I remember that when I was learning to become a CNA, I had to check a blood pressure. I had to know what a normal range of a blood pressure was and a normal range of a heart rate was so that I could report it to my nurse as a CNA. And I feel like perhaps that is not taught in every CNA class now. I don't think that they're learning the same level of things that maybe we learned 30 years ago when we were becoming CNAs and becoming nurses. Even the nursing scope of practice has been really defined over the last 30 years. I remember when I became an LPN, we were able to become delegated to become IV certified. We were allowed to hang bags of fluids that were pre-mixed. We were allowed to flush, peripheral lines. We were allowed to do a lot more things. And then the state came in and said, oh, no, we don't want LPNs to do X, Y, and Z. And so when I was a baby LPN, I was given an order to push IV Lasix in a skilled nursing facility. Now, we had things called drug books when I was a baby LPN. We still have drug books like Mosby's and things like that, but I don't see drug books hanging around nursing homes and long-term care as much as I did whenever I was a baby nurse. And I have seen one in the office that I work at for hospice. I've seen drug books, but I think a lot of people are dependent upon their phone for that information and have that at their fingertips now. But when I was a young nurse, we had a book, we looked up the drug, and it gave the amount of minutes that you should be pushing that medication for, what side effects you should be monitoring for. And I want to tell you, I was terrified. And this is a situation where I should have said, no, I don't feel like that's in my scope of practice. And I didn't, and everything was fine, and I pushed it over the required number of minutes. But I will tell you that I was probably holding my breath the whole time, because when you go to nursing school, they tell you, if this happens, this can happen. If this happens, this can happen. And I think that the things that we learn in nursing school, what sticks with you, what stands out, what's stuck in your brain from nursing school. I remember we did peritoneal dialysis in skilled nursing facilities when I was a young nurse. I don't see it as much anymore, but I know it's still something that can happen. And I know sometimes they're doing hemodialysis in the home now, and that's not something you would have seen maybe 30 years ago. But we had peritoneal dialysis, and they trained us how those bags needed to be placed, what bag went where, and sunny side up, and peritonitis kills. So the dialysate gets put into the peritoneal cavity, and it sits in there for a prescribed amount of time, and then you drain it off, and it works through osmosis and pulls all the toxins out. It works that way, if memory serves. It's been a long time since I've done that. Again, don't take everything that I say as the law. Please do your own research and understand that this is just from my own memory and my own experience, and always consult with a doctor. I do not replace the advice of an MD. So I remember, though, that anytime I did peritoneal dialysis, I was terrified. I didn't want somebody to get an infection. It was a sterile procedure. You had to wear a mask. You had to make sure that cap didn't touch anything, that this thing never got touched by anything, that it was clean. The cap was put on, it was clean. Then I remember the first time I learned to do a Plerex drain. Well, that was scary in and of itself too. But what I will tell you, and this goes back to what I say, if you've not done something before, if you're not comfortable doing it, please don't ever feel obligated to perform that procedure. If you've never done peritoneal dialysis, if you've never drained a Plerex drain, don't do it without talking to your supervisor and saying, hey, I've never done this before and I don't feel comfortable doing it. Can you please have somebody demonstrate this for me? Absolutely go to YouTube, watch a video. YouTube's great for this, right? This is the benefit of having the internet at our fingers. We can watch videos that show us how to do procedures. We don't have to look for a big medical book and read all of those instructions like we used to. There are people actually demonstrating. The manufacturer actually has videos online that you can watch about how to do these procedures. It tells you the recommendations for the blood pressures, when to stop it, how to hold it. But my thing is, if you've never done it and you're not comfortable doing it, then ethically you shouldn't do it. You should say that you're not comfortable doing something. If you know that it's outside of your scope of practice, even if all of your friends did it at work, even if all of your colleagues are doing it, if you stand before a board of nursing or you go to court someday, they will not accept the answer that all of your colleagues were doing it. What they're going to want to know is if you knew it was wrong, if you knew it was outside of your scope of practice. So always know your scope of practice. Always feel comfortable going to your supervisor or your colleague that asks you to do something that's outside of your scope of practice. Always feel comfortable saying, I'm sorry, I don't feel comfortable doing that. Because I had a nursing instructor, her name was Trish, and she was such a bold person. I aspired to be her someday. She was blunt, she was outspoken, and she worked hard to get her credentials. And she made sure you knew she worked hard to get her credentials and that you were not going to be the person that damaged them. She said, that's my rice bowl. That's how I feed my family. That's how I feed my kids. That's how I take care of my life. And we're not going to do this any way but the correct way. She's also the same person that told us peritonitis kills. And it's stuck in my brain every time I did peritoneal dialysis on a patient years ago. I heard her voice in my head. Same thing with accessing a portacath. I had an instructor named Georgia, and her voice is in my head. She taught us how to open everything with one hand and remain sterile. We had to do that to pass our clinical with her, and she was a terrifying woman and very, very smart and very capable and knowledgeable for the time. And I still hear her voice in my head when I have to access a portacath or flush a central line. So I think that you worked hard to get your credentials, whatever they may be. And it's important for you to know your scope of practice. And it's important for you to not ever do something that you have never done and that you're not comfortable with. Again, have you ever had a time when someone asked you to do something that you weren't comfortable with? How did you handle it? Did you feel comfortable enough to say no? Or did you go ahead and get through it? Like me, pushing IV Lasix almost 30 years ago. How did you handle it? I wish when I was a baby nurse that I had had the confidence to say, I'm not comfortable doing that, to the doctor and to my director of nursing. Sometimes you do something and nothing happens as a result of that choice. But there is a big likelihood that you could do something and something fatal could occur. So always protect your license, always cover your butt, CYA, and always feel confident saying, I'm not comfortable doing that. I thank you so much for watching. And if you like what you see here, I ask you to like, subscribe, and follow for more. And please feel free to leave a comment, ask a question, make a suggestion. Looking forward to it, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.